father told the room he had found the perfect place for his wedding weekend, and everyone turned to me before I had spoken a single word. That is how I understood, in the smallest possible moment, that he had already been discussing my property, as if it belonged to the family more than it belonged to me. We were halfway through dinner at my mother's house. There was rosemary chicken cooling too quickly on a serving platter, a bowl of blistered tomatoes, condensation running down the side of my water glass. My aunt was saying something about chair rentals. My mother was asking whether October would be too cold for an outdoor ceremony. My brother, Julian, leaned back in his chair with the comfortable certainty of a man reporting a solved problem and said, "We're keeping it simple. We're doing it at Lena's place. Not, would Lena be willing? Not, we were wondering. Not even, I forgot to ask first, at Lena's place." I remember setting my fork down because I knew if I kept holding it, I'd either bend the tines or point it at him, and I was trying very hard to remain a person nobody could call dramatic. I said, "My place?" He smiled as if I were being cute. "The cottage. It's perfect. Rustic, private, pretty views, enough room for tents if people spread out." His fiancée, Noelle, looked relieved when he said it, like she had been carrying a budget she did not know how to solve, and had finally decided the answer was hidden in someone else's life. My mother did not look surprised. That detail mattered. She did not look surprised, which meant this idea had already lived somewhere outside my hearing. I said, "You mean my cottage that runs on an old holding tank and a fussy water pump?" Julian laughed once. "That's the spirit. We'll keep it low-key." There are few feelings lonelier than hearing a person step over your first no before you have even fully said it. The cottage is not inherited land, and it is not a weekend hobby the family can romanticize, because they remember me wearing muddy boots. I bought it myself 4 years ago, when it was barely more than a collapsing shell, with ivy strangling one side and a porch that listed so badly you could feel your balance change walking across it. People called it charming, in the way people use that word when they do not intend to spend $1 or an hour on what something needs. I was 28 then, working 2 jobs, sleeping badly, and carrying around the private fear that if I did not build one thing that was fully mine, I would spend my whole life living inside arrangements other people had designed for me. So I bought the little stone cottage at the edge of a defunct orchard and spent 4 years putting my body into it. I learned how to pry out warped boards without cracking the beams beneath them. I learned which kind of sealant let the old pine breathe and which kind trapped moisture like a lie. I spent Saturdays scraping paint off windows with a razor blade while rain tapped the glass. I sanded floors on my knees. I drove home with dust in my hair and my wrists burning, and still felt more peaceful there than I had ever felt in any polished apartment I was supposedly meant to want instead. It was not luxurious. It was honest. 2 bedrooms, 1 narrow bath, a galley kitchen, old pipes, temperamental heat, and a backfield that looked golden in late afternoon if you stood at the right angle and forgave the wild patches. To me, it was not a venue. It was proof that my life was not entirely rented. Julian has never understood that kind of attachment unless it belongs to him. He is 3 years older than I am and has always moved through the family with the casual faith of a person who assumes a net will appear wherever he steps. He is not evil. That would actually make him simpler. He is charming, quick with compliments, and genuinely convinced that his confidence is generosity. Growing up, he borrowed before asking, promised my help before checking, and called me difficult whenever I objected to being volunteered for my own inconvenience. When we were kids, that looked like him telling neighbors I could babysit. When we were teenagers, it looked like him taking my car because he needed it more. When we were adults, it looked like him joking that I was selfish for not wanting 12 relatives to stay at my apartment over Thanksgiving, because, in his words, you're better at making things cozy. The family's favorite word for him has always been easy. Julian is easygoing, Julian is easy to love, Julian just gets excited. The hidden cost of a man being called easy all his life is that someone else is always expected to absorb the difficulty he creates. Usually, in our family, that someone was me. At dinner, I tried once more to bring the conversation back into reality. I said, "How many people are you talking about?" "Around 20, he said. "Maybe more, if some cousins decide to come for the full weekend. But mostly outside. It's not like they'll all be inside at once." As if mud respected thresholds. As if 20 adults sleeping, showering, drinking, cooking, parking, stumbling through a field, and leaning folding chairs into old walls did not count because some of them would technically be under canvas. Noelle finally spoke then, soft and hopeful. We thought the bridal party could stay in the cottage itself, and everybody else could camp. Very simple, very intimate. I stared at her long enough that her smile faltered. Not because I wanted to embarrass her, because I was trying to understand how a grown woman arrives at intimate by first removing the owner from the sentence. I said, "Did either of you plan to ask me before announcing this?" Julian's expression changed by only a degree, but I know him well enough to see the shift. He had expected logistics, maybe a few clarifications. He had not expected the underlying insult to be named aloud. He said, I'm asking now." "No," I said. "You're informing now." The table went still in the way family tables do when everyone senses that politeness is about to lose its job. My mother reached automatically for her glass without drinking from it. My aunt began fussing with a napkin. Noelle looked down at her plate. Julian gave the tight smile he uses when he wants an audience to see him as reasonable. "Lena, come on, don't make it weird. We're family." There it was. The phrase that arrives whenever someone wants to convert your boundaries into a personality flaw. I said, "Family is exactly why you should have asked." He sighed like I was delaying a train. "It's just a weekend. We're trying not to waste money on some sterile venue when you literally already have the perfect spot." Literally, already perfect. The language of entitlement is always so efficient. It erases the years between purchase and possession. It skips over labor like a stone over water. It turns sacrifice into scenery. So I gave him the practical answer first, because people like him always pretend your emotional objection is the only objection. I said the holding tank would not support that many people for 2 or 3 days, never mind 4. I said I do not have event insurance and would not be comfortable with people drinking on the property, camping near the retaining wall, or trekking across the back slope after dark. I said I had only just refinished the floors in the front room and they would be destroyed by boots, spills, and folding tables. I said there were parking issues, neighbor issues, liability issues, and one very simple ownership issue. It is my house. My words were calm. My pulse was not. Julian leaned back and laughed the way people laugh when facts are inconvenient and therefore, in their minds, negotiable. "You are acting like we asked to bulldoze the place." I said, "You didn't ask." Noelle looked miserable by then, and I almost felt sorry for her. Except there is a point at which participating silently in someone else's entitlement is still participating. I tried, because I am the designated reasonable one, to offer a compromise. I said I would happily host a small post-ceremony dinner for immediate family only. 6 people, 8 if we ate outside and the weather held. Candles, roast vegetables, wine, something warm and beautiful and manageable. I even said I would help them think through other affordable options for the larger celebration. Julian heard only the part where the world had failed to obey him. He said, "Ever since you bought that place, you've acted like you're above sharing anything." I wish I could explain how old that accusation felt. Not new enough to hurt in a fresh way, old enough to make your bones tired, above sharing. As if there is no difference between generosity freely chosen and access extracted through pressure. As if the entire moral value of my work was whether other people could use it when it suited them. I said, "Sharing requires consent. What you're describing is taking offense that you didn't get automatic access." He went red around the ears. He said I was prioritizing wood and stone over his wedding. He said I was making him feel unwelcome. He said if I loved him, I would want to be part of the day instead of guarding a building like a museum docent. The building line almost made me laugh. Not because it was funny, because it revealed the whole wound. A building. That was all he could see. Not dawn drives to the hardware store. Not bank statements that made my stomach drop. Not winter weekends spent wearing 2 pairs of socks while I learned how to insulate the back wall properly. Not the scar on my palm from the pane that cracked when I tried to reglaze the sitting room window alone. Not the months of choosing thrift over ease, because I wanted one corner of the world arranged by my own hand. When people have never had to fight for ownership, they often mistake the visible object for the entire story. I said, you are not asking me to be part of your day. You are asking me to risk the thing I built because it happens to solve a budget problem for you. For once, nobody jumped in immediately to smooth it over. I think the plainness of that sentence did something the smaller objections had not. It made the exchange harder to disguise as wedding stress. Julian pushed his chair back too hard. He said he didn't know why I always had to make everything transactional. He said the family had helped me plenty over the years. He reminded everyone that our uncle had once loaned me a trailer, and our mother had watched my dog during a roof repair. This is another old family habit, confusing support with ownership, as though a favor turns into a long-term lien on a woman's boundaries. I said I was grateful for every genuine help I had received. I said gratitude is not the same thing as surrender. I said none of those favors gave him the right to volunteer my home without asking. Then he said something that sounded careless until I realized it was the truest thing he had said all evening. He said, "It's not like you even use it for anything important." I went very still. There are insults that strike like impact, and then there are insults that open like trap doors beneath old understanding. Not anything important. A place I had rescued. A place where I wrote, hosted 2 friends through divorces, cried after my promotion was denied, celebrated when I finally got a better job, learned how to be alone without being lonely, learned how to trust my own decisions when nobody was clapping for them. A place that had become the physical form of my adult life. Not important. I think that was the moment I stopped trying to sound agreeable. Not unkind. Just finished. I said, "Then it should be very easy for you to find somewhere else." Noelle whispered Julian's name like maybe he still had time to reverse the car before it went into the ditch. He ignored her. He told me I was overreacting over grass, plumbing, and old boards. He said people camp in rougher conditions all the time. He said I cared more about a rustic aesthetic than about family. I said, I care more about being asked than being assumed. That line landed harder than I expected. Maybe because the rest of the room understood, even if nobody wanted to admit it, that asking had never really been the plan. Dinner ended badly, the way these things do. Julian muttered that he couldn't believe I would do this to him over one weekend. He left first. Noelle followed with the expression of someone who had mistaken passivity for safety and just learned it has a price. My mother started clearing plates too fast, which is what she does when she wants noise to cover the absence of resolution. I helped her in silence for a minute before she said, very gently, "Maybe you could think about some middle road." I almost laughed. Middle roads are only offered to the person already standing at the edge. I asked what middle road she had in mind. She said perhaps I could rent portable toilets, restrict guests from certain rooms, put down mats over the floors, make everyone sign some kind of agreement. She said Julian was hurt. She said weddings make people emotional. She said maybe I was being a little rigid because I felt blindsided. Maybe, as if my objection had been caused by surprise and not by the disrespect surprise exposed. I said, if he had come to me privately and asked humbly, I still would have said no, but I would not be feeling this. She looked at me then. What is this? I dried a plate slowly before answering. This feeling that all the work I do becomes public property the minute it starts looking useful. My mother's face changed. Not all the way, but enough. Enough that I knew she recognized the sentence before she was ready to challenge it. Because this was never only about the cottage. It was about years of being the dependable daughter, the one who remembers birthdays, brings the extra folding chairs, stays late to clean, notices when the dog's medicine is running low, offers to drive because someone else had wine, fixes the zipper, patches the curtain, organizes the meal train, answers the call, softens the conflict, absorbs the inconvenience. Families praise this kind of woman endlessly while quietly rearranging their expectations around her depletion. Then one day she says no, at the wrong moment, and everybody acts like a wall appeared where a door used to be. But the wall is not new. The wall is simply the first visible proof that the door was never meant to stay open forever. For 3 days, Julian did not speak to me. He left our sibling group chat. He replied to my one attempt at peace with a single word, fine, that managed to contain neither peace nor fine. My mother called twice under the pretense of checking on me, which is her way of checking whether guilt is ripening properly. I drove out to the cottage on the fourth morning with more anger than I wanted and more clarity than I expected. The air smelled like dry grass and cedar. A storm the night before had left beads of water clinging to the herb boxes under the kitchen window. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and felt the boards answer under my feet in the familiar, quiet way they do when the house has held its own temperature overnight. There are places that make you ask whether you deserve them. This place always made me ask whether I was finally becoming myself there. I made coffee and carried it onto the back step. From there, I could see exactly what Julian had seen. The open field where tents could fit, the line of trees that made the property feel secluded, the good photograph angles, the illusion that the land was blank and available because it was beautiful. Beauty makes people forget maintenance. If a thing looks effortless by the time they arrive, they often assume it costs nothing to keep that way. I sat with that for a long time. Then I realized something that embarrassed me a little. Part of why I felt so shaken was not fear of damage. It was grief. Not for the wedding I would miss, because I could still attend if they found another venue. Grief for the version of family where my work might have been admired before it was requested. Grief for the fantasy that if I kept building quietly enough, generously enough, competently enough, nobody would ever force me to defend the right to my own labor. I had always known Julian was entitled. What hurt was seeing how many people around him treated his entitlement as an opening bid instead of a moral failure. That afternoon, he finally called. I answered because refusing would have kept the wound theatrical, and I was done performing injury when clarity would do. He did not apologize. That is important. He came armed with a softened version of the same assumption. He said he had been thinking. He said maybe he had sprung it on me badly. He said perhaps they could cut the guest list to 15 and keep everyone outside except immediate family. He said maybe they could cover the floors with runners and ask people not to wear heels. He said he was trying to compromise. I listened all the way through. Then I said, Julian, you are still negotiating with a no. He exhaled like I was impossible. You really can't do this one thing for me? It is amazing how often one thing means the largest thing in the room. I said, you keep calling it one thing because you don't want to name its size. He got quiet. I went on. You did not ask because, on some level, you didn't think my answer mattered until it inconvenienced you. Silence. Then the defensive laugh. That's not fair. I said, it's exactly fair. If you believed it was mine in the full sense of the word, you would have come to me before speaking about it as settled. You would have considered what it cost me to build. You would have treated my hesitation as information instead of betrayal. When he finally spoke, his voice was sharper. You're reading way too much into this. Maybe, but people only say that when the plain reading is too uncomfortable to survive. I said I loved him. I said I wanted his marriage to begin in joy. I said none of that changed my answer. Then I said the truest thing I had learned all week. Being family does not mean you get to meet my devotion only at the point where it becomes useful to you. He had no response for that. Not a real one. He said he had to go. He hung up first. Later my mother called again. This time she sounded tired rather than diplomatic. She said Julian had found a county lodge near the lake. She said it would cost more than they hoped. She said he was still upset. Then, after a pause, she said, he really didn't think you'd say no. I know, I said. There was a long silence in which we both understood that this was not comforting. It was the diagnosis. She asked if I wanted to come by Sunday for lunch. I said yes, because boundaries are not exile and I did not want this to become a legend about my unforgiving nature. I went. Julian was civil and injured in the polished way people become when they want the room to witness their restraint. Noelle hugged me too hard. My mother overfed everyone. Life continued, because it usually does, even when a truth has entered it that no one can remove. But something inside me had steadied. Not because I won. This was not winning. No one likes discovering that love in a family can remain intact while access changes shape. No one enjoys being recast, however quietly, from easy daughter to woman with terms. What steadied me was simpler. I had finally refused the oldest translation in our family, that my care existed for common use. That is what the comments on the source story seemed to understand so quickly. People were not only reacting to a rude brother or a cheap wedding plan, They were reacting to the familiar pattern beneath it: the son who assumes, the daughter who maintains, the mother who asks the daughter to smooth over what the son made jagged, the years of labor that are admired just enough to become claimable. A lot of readers focused on the practical proof objects too, and they were right to. Old plumbing, liability, floors, water, cleanup, insurance. Those details matter because they keep the story honest. But the reason the thread held emotional weight is that everyone recognized the symbolic version at the same time. The cottage was not just a cottage. It was the visible record of effort, and my brother did not want to borrow that record. He wanted to act as if it had always been available to him. I still go there most weekends. Sometimes I bring friends. Sometimes I bring no one. Sometimes I sit on the back step with tea and watch the evening move over the field until the whole place looks bronzed and temporary and far more peaceful than any human conflict deserves. The floors are holding up beautifully. The pump still complains if I run the shower and dishwasher too close together. The orchard is still mostly wild. Nothing dramatic changed about the property itself. What changed was my understanding of what I had built there. I thought I was building a refuge. I was. But I was also building evidence. Evidence that my labor has shape. Evidence that love does not require surrender. Evidence that a woman can be generous without making herself indefinitely available. If that sounds severe, it isn't. It is actually the gentlest truth I know. Because once you stop calling entitlement love, you become much kinder to yourself. And once you become kinder to yourself, other people's disappointment stops sounding so much like authority.
Thank you for watching. If this story pulled you in, do me one favor. Hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so the next one finds you the moment it drops. Remember, nothing is ever just what it seems. See you on the next one.